Okay, and with this, I turn to the political role of Rawls's criterion of reflective equilibrium, or CRE. To assist my reading, I make the following assumption. In the context at hand, views to the effect that political things depend for relevant political merit, such as their reasonableness or their legitimacy, on their equal acceptability by reasonable people reflects a commitment to the public justifiability of these things or of claims that they have the relevant merit. Thus, roughly, a commitment to the equal acceptability of political things by reasonable people marks a commitment to the view that these things need to be publicly justifiable. With this in mind, consider the political role of reflective equilibrium. Rawls tells us that any conception of political justice, quote, to be acceptable, must accord with our considered convictions at all levels of generality on due reflection, or in what I have called elsewhere reflective equilibrium, close quote. Very roughly, we can say that phi is in reflective equilibrium with a set of views S only if phi coheres with S, and each member of S is well considered, and S is internally coherent. Now, much here depends on the standpoint from which reflective equilibrium is sought. And Rawls highlights that it is from the standpoint of, as he puts this, you and me, or us, from which JF, that is justice is fairness, or any other conception of justice must be coherently acceptable. Accordingly, he writes that the test of reflective equilibrium tests how well a conception of justice, quote, as a whole articulates our more firm considered convictions of political justice at all levels of generality after due examination once all adjustments and revisions that seem compelling have been made. A conception of justice that meets this criterion is the conception of justice that, so far as we can now ascertain, is the most reasonable for us. Close quote. Elsewhere, Rawls tells us that JF aims to articulate our considered convictions, while, quote, we decide whether the whole conception is acceptable by seeing whether we can endorse it upon due reflection. Close quote. However, who exactly is being referred to here as you and me, or we? Of course, Rawls refers to actual people, but not just any actual person. After all, Rawls presents his own theory, justice is fairness, or JF, as a political and liberal conception of justice, in part because he believes that JF, in this form, stands a fair chance of meeting the criterion of reflective equilibrium. Yet, trivially, CRE, that criterion, would disqualify JF if JF must be coherently acceptable, also from the perspective of people who cannot coherently accept political liberalism's liberal political values. Thus, while Rawls assumes that the reflective equilibria of actual citizens count, he evidently supposes that only those actual citizens count who can coherently accept political liberalism's most important political values. In other words, justice is fairness needs to be coherently acceptable from the perspective of people who are reasonable in political liberalism's sense. Yet, it seems fair to assume that if the reflective equilibria of these people count, then they count equally. And if we put these things together, then what emerges is that conceptions of political justice must attain a form of what Rawls calls general reflective equilibrium. That is, the criterion of reflective equilibrium specifies in what way a conception of political justice must be acceptable by each reasonable person for this to count toward the equal acceptability of that conception by all reasonable people. And this suggests that we attribute to Rawls the view actualist public justification for a conception of political justice phi. On the slide, that's APJ. Phi is reasonable if and only if phi is equally acceptable coherently by or publicly justifiable to actual reasonable citizens, where phi is equally acceptable coherently by alpha and beta only if each can accept phi coherently in CRE's sense, and citizens are reasonable in political liberalism's sense. Okay, so some comments on place. To fully support this reading, a good deal of reconstructive work is needed, of course. And this is nothing that I can do here, although I cover some of the relevant ground in the lecture readings. So if you want to have more detail on what justifies or supports the reading I develop here, please also consult the lecture readings. For now, I only add 4 comments. First, actualist public justification is public in a robust sense, as Gerald Postema puts it. Rawls does not claim that a reasonable conception of political justice will also be acceptable by reasonable people. He makes the much stronger constructivist claim that the reasonableness of such a conception depends on or is constituted by its acceptability by reasonable people. This reflects that Rawls allocates a justificatory say or discursive respect to reasonable people at the fundamental level of political justification. That means that if actual reasonable citizens cannot actually coherently accept a proposed conception of political justice, then this counts as evidence that this conception is not reasonable. And if they cannot actually coherently reject the proposed conception, then this counts as evidence that this conception is reasonable. And for Rawls, only a reasonable conception of political justice can provide a basis for a legitimate exercise of political power. The second comment is this: the role of actualist and fundamental public justification helps to explain why Rawls insists that political liberalism applies the principle of toleration to philosophy itself. For Rawls, to apply this principle to philosophy is to require conceptions of political justice to avoid reasonable disagreement. Now, Rawls arguably takes it that if phi is reasonably rejected by some reasonable citizens and reasonably accepted by other reasonable citizens, then phi is the subject of reasonable disagreement. But if phi is the subject of such disagreement, then there is evidence that phi is not equally acceptable by all reasonable citizens. Hence, if a conception of political justice must meet a test of actualist public justification, then it should avoid reasonable disagreement or be tolerant in Rawls' sense. But of course, toleration here is tied to a non-rejection of important liberal political values. The commitment to avoid reasonable disagreement is a commitment to avoid disagreement that can arise between actual reasonable people, and by definition, these are people who can accept political liberalism's most important liberal values. Accordingly, the search for a publicly justifiable and tolerant conception of political justice here from the ground up privileges the perspective of people who are reasonable in political liberalism's sense. Here are 2 additional comments. They concern Rawls' idea of the original position, or OP, and his idea of reasonable overlapping consensus. Both ideas are often taken to play essential justification roles in Rawls' position. This makes it instructive to see how these ideas relate to actualist and fundamental public justification. I start with the original position, or OP. OP models an idea of rational choice under reasonable constraints. The parties of the original position rationally decide, behind a veil of ignorance that guarantees their impartiality, what principles of political justice they or the people they represent would have to live under. And Rawls argues that they would choose the principles of justice that his own view, Justice as Fairness, or JF, puts forward. Now, many theorists read the original position as modeling a standard of practical reason such that if any actual person cannot accept the principles that the parties of the original position would choose, then this person must be unreasonable or irrational. However, in light of the role of actualist public justification, this cannot be entirely right. After all, the idea of the original position is part of Rawls's theory, JF. And JF, like every other conception of political justice, depends for its own reasonableness on its equal acceptability by actual reasonable citizens. That just means that actualist public justification here is fundamental. But then the reasonableness of these citizens cannot depend on their acceptance of the principles that would be chosen within the original position. For this would be blatantly circular. In this slide, consider what Rawls tells us in the following passage, and I quote, "The original position, OP, models what we regard, you and I here and now, as fair and reasonable conditions for the parties who are rational representatives of free and equal, reasonable and rational citizens. OP also models what we regard as appropriate restrictions on reasons for adopting a political conceptions of justice for the basic structure of society. We conjecture that the conception of political justice the parties would select is a conception that you and I here now would regard as reasonable and rational and supported by the best reasons. Whether the conjecture is borne out will depend on whether you and I here now can, on due reflection, endorse the principles adopted." Close quote. In other words, OP models what you and I see as reasonable and rational deliberation or as appropriate restrictions on reasons for adopting a political conception of justice. And OP's success as such a model turns on whether OP's results match what you and I regard as reasonable and rational. Accordingly, Rawls writes that OP is a means of, quote, public reflection and self-clarification, close quote, that aims to help us attain, quote, deeper self-understanding and, quote, greater coherence among all our judgment, close quote, with the help of which, quote, we can attain wider agreement among one another. Well, again, we need to ask, what people does Rawls refer to? Well, these seem to be the people from the perspective of whom justice as fairness must be acceptable for it to be reasonable in the first place, namely actual reasonable citizens. If this is right, then the following is suggested. The original position is a reconstructive device that aims to clarify implications of the actual self-understanding of actual reasonable citizens. OP's success as such a device depends on whether its results suitably cohere with the considered judgments of these actual reasonable citizens. And whether OP accomplishes this is something that these actual citizens must assess from the standpoint of their considered judgments. If these actual citizens, upon reflection, conclude that OP's results indeed fit their self-understanding, then OP is successful as a reconstructive device. But if they conclude that OP does not fit their self-understanding, then these citizens must decide from their perspective whether to revise or reject justice as fairness. Either way, the considered judgments of actual reasonable citizens have the last word. It follows that it is not the case that if any actual citizens cannot accept the principles that would be chosen in the original position, then these citizens must be unreasonable or irrational. at least in relation to actual reasonable citizens, the dependency is reversed. If any actual reasonable citizen cannot coherently accept these principles, then this must call into question the reasonableness of these principles, if this is the conclusion favored by the considered judgments of actual reasonable citizens. All right. With this, I briefly turn to the aim of reasonable overlapping consensus. On a standard reading, Rawls claims that a conception of justice can be stable only if it attains an overlapping consensus between the reasonable comprehensive doctrines that reasonable citizens endorse. And this refers to reasonable worldviews or outlooks, be these moral, political, religious, or philosophical worldviews or outlooks. However, in light of the above, there must be more to the aim of reasonable overlapping consensus. In an important passage, Rawls writes the following, and again I quote, "Public justification happens when all the reasonable members of political society carry out the justification of the shared political conception by embedding it in their several reasonable comprehensive views. In this case, reasonable citizens take one another into account as having reasonable comprehensive doctrines that endorse that political conception. Only when there is a reasonable overlapping consensus can political society's political conception of justice be publicly, though never finally, justified. Be publicly, though never finally justified. Granting that we should give weight to the considered convictions of other reasonable citizens, this is because general and wide reflective equilibrium with respect to a public justification gives the best justification of the political conception that we can have at any given time. There is no public justification for political society without a reasonable overlapping consensus.